Scripture reading will be from Philippians 3:13. Philippians 3:13. Brethren, I do not regard myself as having laid hold of it yet, but one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and reaching forward to what lies ahead. That was Philippians 3:13.
Hope 2016 is good for you so far, and a lot of blessings are ahead for us, and I'm excited to be here at Miller Street. I'm sure you are too, and it's good to be here together this morning, start out the year. I thought I'd share with you to kind of lead into the lesson this morning that I took some classes at UCD, and I was putting this together, and I was reminded of this. I lived in a part of town where I had to ride my bicycle to UCD downtown Denver. And the trip there, in order to get there the shortest way, I had to go through, they always say, the bad part of town. Well, it was one of those parts of town. Wherever that might be, it probably differs on the person. Especially if you live there, you probably wouldn't consider it. But I had to go through a bad part of town. And I always, no matter how tired I was, at the end, it was usually in the evening, I was headed to class. I always found extra energy during that stretch. I went really fast on the bicycle. I was the guy on the bicycle just flying down the sidewalk. So if you see somebody going through your part of town, maybe he thinks he's in a bad part of town. If you have a big enough city, it seems like there's always this one part that everybody's like, oh yeah, that's the bad part, don't go there. Or if you have to, you better go fast. And even some cities as a whole have gained reputations. I remember seeing in a book where I never really thought about it before, but they pointed out how a lot of cities have, whether it's necessarily bad or good, definite reputations. Certain personalities come to mind, I guess, for the city as a whole. You say, oh, New York. Well, yeah. Or Los Angeles, or Chicago, or Las Vegas. Certain things come to mind and say, okay, this city has settled into a kind of reputation. And we all have an image in our head of different things. Maybe it depends on whether you have fond memories of that city or not. We're going to talk about a city. The reason I bring this up is we're going to talk about one city in particular, and you've heard it mentioned many, many times, but you may have the wrong idea of what this city was like, about what kind of city it was. There was a city called Jericho, and I'll start off by just telling you and being up front, it was a horrible, horrible place. When the Israelites arrived, when we first read about this city of Jericho, when they arrived, there's of course to take over the promised land. It's occupied, and the land was so spiritually decadent, God authorized the execution of everyone there. And I know a lot of people read through their Bibles and they get to that part, and it just seems so over the top. But maybe the best way to think about it is the promised land was infected with a terminal case of degradation. It was diseased. It was almost as if Canaan was a dying patient, and the Canaanites were an aggressive cancer. The only feasible treatment was drastic amputation. It was brutal, it was scary, but it was significant. It was necessary. In fact, the Canaanites were far worse than cancer. They didn't just infect your physical body, they infected your soul. And I kind of need to go dark a little bit just to make a point this morning so we can see the circumstances that'll be relevant for us. It was so serious, the infection of the people's souls there. That's why God commanded complete annihilation. It was like a skilled surgeon. And what you're about to read and what I'm sure you're aware of is it was a Jerichoectomy. It was time to just completely eliminate the threat. When you imagine Jericho, don't picture a pleasant city. Everybody's out there doing their gardening, and all of a sudden these bad guys come over the hill. That's not what it was like. It was not a city filled with innocent people. In fact, the very existence of the city was defiance of God. The name Jericho was a tribute to a false moon god. I guess you pronounce his name Yerak. And the inhabitants of Jericho also worshipped a goddess named Anath. And she was the very definition of sexual immorality and merciless violence, about as worse as you can imagine. Those who worshipped her indulged in excessive degradation. These are the members who lived in Jericho. Those who worshipped her killed people just for the sheer joy of it. It was emphasized in order to worship her That's how you did that. In fact, there was even an image of her, and it depicted a laughing woman standing in blood, standing on bones. It was just a bad image. And that's what they worshiped. That's what Jericho was about. If you lived back then and somebody said the name Jericho, that's what would come to mind. And that's bad enough. The Canaanites were also known. Psalm 106 talks about the lengths that they went to in order to worship these false gods. And this passage alone is enough to condemn Jericho as a horrible, horrible place. There's nothing worse than being a pagan in Jericho. It was such a foul place that when it was destroyed and Joshua and his men finally stood on the rubble, they did something that they didn't do to a lot of the other towns. They sealed it with a curse. Joshua 6:26. I don't know if you ever noticed this distinction for Jericho. I'll read this to you. Joshua 6:26. They destroyed a lot of towns, a lot of cities. But Jericho, when they got done, said they cursed it. They don't ever touch this again. Joshua 6:26. Then Joshua made them take an oath at that time, saying, "Cursed before the Lord is the man who rises up and builds this city Jericho. With the loss of his firstborn, he shall lay its foundation, and with the loss of his youngest son, he shall set up its gates." Interestingly enough, a man years later named Hiel defied this warning, and it cost him 2 of his sons. If you jump over to 1 Kings 16:34, he defies this curse, and it cost him. 1 Kings 16:34, in his days, Hiel the Bethelite built Jericho. He laid its foundations with the loss of Abiram, his firstborn, and set up its gates with the loss of his youngest son, Segub, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke by Joshua the son of Nun. God was so disgusted with Jericho, he uses people to reduce it to rubble and then cursed anyone who tried to put it back together again. That's serious. Here's the point. Jericho was a horrible, horrible place. In this horrible place, there lived a woman named Rahab. I don't know, we don't know a lot about her. If you met her, when she said her name, you might have done a double take. In her language, Rahab, her name meant insolence. I don't know if her parents were trying to keep up with the cultural immorality and they would name their daughter that name, or maybe she gave herself that name as she made bad choices in her life. But when you met her and she told you her name, Rahab, it meant insolence. Either way, the name does not imply morality. So Rahab lived in one of the darkest cities that ever existed and went by the name of insolence. And as if that wasn't bad enough, she spent her days living one of the most demeaning and corrupt existences possible. Nothing worse than being a pagan in Jericho, except maybe being a prostitute in Jericho. The city reeked of perversions, but Rahab lived even below that. Her life was not even really life. It was a daily spiral into spiritual decay. If there was ever someone to write off, to dismiss as a lost cause, the prostitute of Jericho named Insolence would probably be the one that would come to mind. But then something happened. I'm so happy to tell you that's not the end of the story. 2 guys show up, 2 men of God, and they sneak into Jericho. They're on a reconnaissance mission. The king of Jericho heard about these 2 guys who had infiltrated the city, and he instigates a search. Well, as you know, Rahab hid these 2 men and kept them safe on the roof. And that brings to mind a question: why would this ungodly, moral, worldly woman help these 2 strangers? And the Bible tells us why. It's in Joshua 2. It tells us why Rahab, of all people, would do such a thing. She'd heard of these 2 guys, or at least the people that they were with. Rumors had been spread. Joshua 2, verse 8. She explains to them what's going on in her mind. Joshua 2, verse 8. Now before they lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, "I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us. and that all the inhabitants of the land have melted away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon. He was a king of the Amorites, by the way. And Og, O-G, we'll talk about him later. He was a giant whom you utterly destroyed. When we heard it, our hearts melted, and no courage remained in any man any longer because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. The people of Jericho, Rahab included, had heard about the Israelites. She had heard about this God who apparently was the real one. He had overpowered the most powerful nation in existence at the time, opened up an ocean for his people, defeated kings and giants for them. Rahab had heard about all this, and she says, our hearts melted. We're so scared of you. Your God is the real God. And now his people have come to Jericho, which means Jericho's days are numbered. This was Rahab's chance. Joshua 2:12. So this is what she thinks of, Rahab in Joshua 2:12. Now therefore, please swear to me by the Lord, since I have dealt kindly with you, that you also will deal kindly with my father's household, and give me a pledge of truth, and spare my father and my mother and my brothers and my sisters with all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from death. See, we learn a little bit more about Rahab here. Something else to know about her, she loves her family. And she asked for protection for her father, mother, brothers, and sisters. And the two men of God agreed. This is Joshua 2:14. So the men said to her, our life for yours, if you do not tell this business of ours. And it shall come about when the Lord gives us the land that we will deal kindly and faithfully with you. And you probably remember there was a scarlet cord that was part of the deal. Here's Joshua 2:17. Here's the arrangement, Joshua 2:17. The men said to her, we shall be free from this oath to you, which you have made us swear, unless, when we come into the land, you tie this cord of scarlet thread in the window through which you let us down, and gather to yourself into the house your father and your mother and your brothers and all your father's household. It shall come about that anyone who goes out of the doors of your house into the street, his blood shall be on his own head, and we shall be free. But anyone who is with you in the house, his blood shall be on our head, if a hand is laid on him. In other words, if you're inside here, in your home, everybody's safe here. When this cord is put in position, when it's placed, Rahab's home became the only safe place in Jericho. It's kind of like a storm shelter. As long as whoever was in there stayed inside, they'd be safe. But you might think of it this way, Rahab's life in Jericho is about to come to an end. For 6 days, Rahab and her family, I don't know if you ever thought it from their perspective, for 6 days they heard the horns of Israel outside. And on the seventh day, the horns sounded 7 times, and then the world fell apart. Soldiers poured into the city, wiped out every single citizen of Jericho. Almost everyone. When the battle was over and when the curse was established, Israel turned its back on the rubble of this horrible city. And I love that among the victors was a new family. Rahab, her father, and her mother and brothers and sisters, they had all become part of the people of God. That scarlet cord saved Rahab's life. But in a sense, it destroyed it. When Jericho was destroyed, one of the casualties was Rahab the prostitute. That woman died with the rest, so to speak. But Rahab the Israelite walked away a new woman. I can't help but think that maybe she walked away very, very happy. That was all gone. All that darkness was gone. Rahab went on to live a completely different life. You know, sometimes I wonder about Paul. You probably have too, because he used to be this Christian hunter. He specifically went out and was responsible for the death of many Christians, and I've often wondered about the baggage that he carried around, about his old life, that he, maybe he thought about it once in a while. He was responsible for their deaths. He was converted, but he had to deal with that guilt. And it's important to keep in mind with Paul, his new life would have been no use to anyone if he had let his old life haunt him always. He would have just been always looking down unable to really engage what was currently going on. That's why I asked Rocky to read Philippians 3:13. This is what Paul says about his past. Philippians 3:13, brethren, I do not regard myself as having laid hold of it yet, but one thing I do, he says, one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and reaching forward to what lies ahead. I hope Rahab was able to do that as she walked away from Jericho and into her new life. Being human, I suspect that Jericho haunted her once in a while. There may be some dark memories for her. But as she put some miles between herself and her old life, maybe Jericho was more like a bad dream that she had a long time ago. I think it's very possible the blessings of her new life eventually drowned out the regret of her old life, almost like it happened to somebody else. I don't know if you know this, Rahab went on to be a wife and mother. I bet a lot of you know this. In fact, the truth is stranger than fiction. She ended up marrying one of the spies. I never really noticed that before. His name was Salmon. He was one of the guys, what a story that makes, but the truth is stranger than fiction. She turns out this guy that she marries was one of the princes of Judah. How's that for a happy ending? They went on to have a son named Boaz, and he's that great guy who swept Ruth off her feet. I didn't realize this until getting ready to present this to you. Ruth had more than one mother-in-law. Her more famous one was Naomi. Her other mother-in-law was Rahab. Remember what Ruth said to her first mother-in-law, to Naomi? In Ruth 1:16, it's very famous. Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you, for where you go, I will go. And where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. I suspect Ruth and Rahab had a lot to talk about. They had a lot of things in common. Both had made the decision to leave an old life behind to pursue a new life. And maybe they helped each other in that regard and say, yeah, there was that other life, but this is who we are now. I think it's very significant that Ruth's other mother-in-law was Rahab. When Boaz and Ruth had children, this made Rahab a grandmother. And you're way ahead of me. Rahab's great-great-grandson was King David, which means Rahab was one of the key links in the lineage leading to the Messiah. How's that for an even happier ending? I bring all of this up because we have all made some mistakes. There are a lot of people who have made some huge mistakes, and they become Christians, but they carry around a lot of regret. And something everyone needs to keep in mind is that all of us once lived in Jericho. Jesus knocked down the walls to get us out. In fact, that very image is used in Ephesians 2:14. It's described how he rescued us. Ephesians 2:14 says, for he himself is our peace, who made both groups into one and broke down the barrier of the dividing wall. I don't think it's a coincidence that the cord in the window of Rahab's house was red, the color of blood. Jesus provided us a place of safety too, and it's the only safe place in the world. This whole world is Jericho, and we come out of it to escape. I'm totally guessing, but I suspect Rahab thought about Jericho once in a while, and maybe once in a while she maybe at first got a little grim, maybe thoughtful. But I suspect these moments didn't last long. Maybe they eventually disappeared completely. After all, it's hard to focus on a dark past when the present is so full of bright blessings. I've never met anyone who doesn't have regrets, but I've met a lot of people whose lives are very bright now because they were forgiven through Jesus and have moved on into their new life. It's almost as if that old life happened to someone else. I don't know. Again, this is guessing. I wonder if Rahab kept the cord. I don't know if she kept that scarlet cord. Not to remind her of her old life or her old self, but to remain grateful that her old self was dead and buried. That's kind of what we just did a short time ago as Chris led our minds for the Lord's Supper. We kind of remembered the price that was paid for us. We brought out bread and fruit of the vine. It was to remind us of the price that was paid for our place of safety. Maybe Rahab at first got that scarlet cord out and looked at it once in a while. Maybe she held it for a short time, but I bet she held the baby Boaz more. I heard a story years ago. I haven't been able to find out if it's true, but it's still, I think the point still stands. The story I heard is there was this young girl, I think in the 1800s, and she was given a handkerchief as a gift. And back then, you could get some really nice ones. I guess it was exceptionally made. It had design embroidery on the side, and it was made of silk or something valuable like that. And even had her initials embroidered on it, so it was one of a kind. It was one of her most valued possessions. And one day, I guess she was writing a letter or something, and she spilled ink on it. And she was devastated. It was ruined, unsalvageable, beyond repair. And she cried and cried, but tears don't remove ink. There was a friend of the family who came to visit, and eventually it came up that she had this handkerchief, and it was mentioned and how it was ruined now. She kept it out of sight. And the friend asked if he could borrow it. And the young girl thought, well, sure. Can't make it any worse. And so he took it home with him. And she, of course, had doubts that he could ever get it clean. And the friend returned with the handkerchief, and when he gave it back to the girl, she broke into tears of relief and gratitude. The handkerchief was not clean. The friend was an incredible artist, and he took the handkerchief home, and using his skills, he added to the stain and transformed it into a one-of-a-kind, beautiful design. And the handkerchief became even more beautiful and valuable to her than before. All of us once lived in Jericho. All of us did. And we have all struggled with sin. We have been forgiven. If you have been baptized into the blood of Jesus, you are spotless. The Bible describes you as being white as snow. Psalm 103, I love this. It says, as far as the east is from the west, that's how far your sins have been removed. But sometimes we carry stains in our minds and might spend a little bit too much time focused on them. I have some really good news. I know this artist. And if you turn your life over to him every day, he can make everything better than it was before. You will not do anybody any good, especially yourself, if you do not put the past behind you when you belong to Jesus. All of us can end up carrying a lot of baggage. If you want prayers for that peace of mind, please let someone know before you leave. If it might be a matter of coming forward, you can make that happen. But we don't underestimate prayer. If you're still living in Jericho, there's really only one thing to say is get out of the world. I encourage you to be baptized. It's the only way out. That's what Scripture says. Jesus has offered you a scarlet cord, a place of safety. He's provided a way out of this situation. There are great blessings ahead for you and for anyone who belongs to God, more than we can imagine. Pray you'll think about this while we stand together and sing.